Welcome to Dr. Gerstenmeyer's here. Good morning. Welcome to our plenary for this morning. It's called Living for a Year on ISS, Early Results and Lessons Learned, and it's hashtag Year in Space. I'm your moderator. My name is John Charles. I'm the Chief Scientist of NASA's Human Research Program, living in Houston, Texas, and I'm very pleased and honored to bring you this distinguished panel for a plenary discussion about our recently concluded one-year mission on the International Space Station. And yes, before the purists start flagging down the volunteers with the notepads, I understand it was not quite a year, it was 340 days, but that's pretty darn close. So we're going to call it a year in space. Our panelists today are here on the stage. Our cosmonaut, Mikhail Kornienko, who spent the year in space on the International Space Station along with the American astronaut Scott Kelly. Mikhail Kornienko is with the Rocket Space Corporation Energia, and he was the Roscosmos cosmonaut on 2 space station missions, one that lasted 176 days and one that lasted 340 days. You'll hear more from him in a moment. Next to him is one of our investigators, Dr. Michael Stenger, who was the principal investigator for a very ambitious investigation we did on the International Space Station for the first time during the one-year mission, and that was called fluid shifts, and you'll hear more from him shortly. And rounding out the panel is my boss's boss, Mr. Bill Gerstenmeyer, who is the Associate Administrator of NASA for Human Exploration and Operations. And it is because of the work that he was able to do that we were able to accomplish this one-year mission. So before we get started with the panel, I would like to give you a little bit of background information on what the one-year mission was all about. To sort of frame your thoughts, please, at any time during the presentations, raise your hand, and we have, I think, 2 volunteers in green shirts with pieces of paper that they will give you for you to write your questions on. They'll, of course, then bring the questions to me, and I will ask the questions of the panelists toward the end of the hour. We have 1 hour. I'm guessing about 10 minutes or so per presenter, and then we'll leave 20 plus minutes for Q&A from the audience. I do want to tell you a little bit about the one-year mission. It is a continuation of the work that was started by the Russian side in the 80s and 90s aboard the space station Mir. Of course, you're familiar with the 14-month flight of Dr. Valery Polyakov, and then other cosmonauts who flew for a year or almost a year or just over a year in space. There's a substantial number of them. But this was a continuation of that trend with updated technologies and new questions based on the information they brought back after those flights. Planning for the one-year mission began in 2012. It was discussed between the partners of the International Space Station, and finally a decision was made to proceed with it. And so in November of 2012, the astronauts and cosmonauts involved were announced. The American side announced Scott Kelly, as I said. The Russian side announced Mikhail Kornienko. At that time, it was expected, I think, to be a 365-day flight. I know that was my expectation, but of course, because of operational considerations, it ended up being 340 days. With that go-ahead, in late 2012, we then commenced in earnest to assemble the life sciences research package for this one-year mission. A lot of very diligent work between myself and my staff and my counterpart on the Russian side from the Institute of Biomedical Problems, Dr. Valery Bogomolov and his group. We came up with a joint research program between the Human Research Program and the Institute of Biomedical Problems. And that joint research program had a set of different kinds of investigations. We had 2 fully integrated flagship investigations. One was called fluid shifts, and you'll hear more from Dr. Stenger about that shortly, and the other was called field test. We don't have anybody that can speak from field test today. Both presenters, both investigators from the field test were unable to travel this today. We also had a set of investigations that were cross-participatory. That is, there were some investigations that looked similar on the Russian side and the US side, and so we had the cosmonaut and the astronaut participate in both of those to facilitate data sharing. And then we had some investigations that were strictly data sharing. The Russians do the Russian experiment, the Americans do the American experiment, and at the end we arranged to exchange data and understand what the similarities were. We also had collaborations between the Russian side and the European Space Agency, and between the Americans and the Japanese Space Agency. So it was a fully multilateral set of investigations that we embarked on this one-year mission with. And as you probably also know from reading Time magazine and other news outlets, we had a twin study because Scott Kelly just luckily just so happened to have an identical twin brother, Mark Kelly, who was a retired astronaut. We did a set of investigations essentially on Mark Kelly to duplicate a lot of the work that we were already doing on Scott Kelly to derive the benefit of having an identical twin brother for a different set of investigations. There were 10 investigations there, and I will not tell you about any of those today. That's a whole different plenary someday in the future. The kinds of investigations that we did do on Mikhail and Scott involved sensory motor function, bone density and changes, fine motor control, parameters that can be detected in the blood, the urine, the saliva, and even the feces. We did cognition studies, sleep studies, journaling, and we did pre- and post-flight studies, including the work that Dr. Stinger will tell you about, and also things like MRIs of imaging of the brain during rest and during active activities. So we had a full scope of investigations. In fact, as I was putting together the plan for the one-year mission, I thought since it's twice as long as a standard mission, we could have twice as many investigations. We almost did that in our approach. So with no further ado, I would like to now turn the floor over to Mikhail Kornienko. In fact, I'm not going to turn the floor over to him. I'm going to ask him a few questions, and he will expand on those as he sees appropriate. The kinds of questions I'm going to ask him, I have questions for all the presenters, so we'll just take it from here. For Mikhail, a couple of questions. The first question is, this was a one-year mission, twice as long as your previous mission. What about it appealed to you? Why did you volunteer for a one-year mission? I'm sorry, very sorry. I also should identify the man with no nameplate here, Igor Kaufman, who is in our staff at the Johnson Space Center. He works in neurosciences. He works on the field test study, and he is also a very good Russian speaker and as our interlocutor for Mikhail Kornienko for problems of language.
So Misha was, first of all, he was curious. He wanted to see how that would work out. Curiosity, that was the main thing. And also he understood that this will lead to future planetary exploration, and that's a very important mission for that purpose. So he was glad to volunteer for this.
Very good. Well, and I think we're all glad that Misha volunteered because he was an excellent crew member to work with. Misha, what were your expectations going into the mission? What were what was different about your preparations for this mission? What did you expect to learn that was different from your first mission? Your expectations in general.
During the 1-year flight. During my 1-year flight, I get a very, very good experience for next missions. I can suggest how you can go to Mars, how you can go to Moon, maybe not, it's only 3 days, but long duration flights. I can say, next guys, how you can do, how you can И ожидал вот этого самого опыта. Вот реально. Потому что я... Игорь, переведи, пожалуйста. I'm very sorry. Sometimes I need to interpreter. Ты понимаешь, я после первого раза прилетел в гораздо худшем состоянии за полгода, чем после второго. Это опыт. Это очень важно. Переведи, я за год, я на следующий день проплыл километр.
So, Misha wasn't sure what to expect. It took him a while to recover after the first mission, and he thought the second one would be probably more difficult, more challenging in terms of recovery, and that was sort of one of his expectations. It turned out to be incorrect because he recovered much faster after the longer mission. The experience certainly helped. In-flight countermeasures helped a lot, and he was happy to learn that the recovery process was much easier for him after the longer mission.
Good. Very interesting. And along those same lines, Misha, what was one of the most memorable things that happened to you, or what is one of your best memories of the one-year mission?
Scott Kelly. Dear friends, it's real friendship between our society. Trust me.
A relatively close call with a foreign object in space when they had to evacuate and go into the Soyuz capsule. There was a relatively close call. That was quite memorable.
And I think, I forget the statistics, but there are a large number of dockings and visiting vehicles and a large number of crew members you overlapped with, substantial, more people than anybody has normally overlapped with on the International Space Station, so you had a chance to see a lot of people come and go as well. I wonder if you think that has any influence on your comfort with this length of a mission versus, let's say, a Mars mission where it'd be just a small number of people for a long period of time. Do you think the turnover and people that you had the chance to interact with made the mission more enjoyable or more tolerable?
Of course, it helped a lot. I mean, having all those vehicles visit the station and the crew rotating definitely helped. And unfortunately, we understand this would not be possible probably in any other long-duration planetary exploration type missions. So he was fortunate to have had this happen. He was a little sad when people left. That reminded him that people come and go, and he's still there. So there is a little bit of that element of sadness. But overall, it was a good, enjoyable experience.
Good, thank you. And be sure, please, to think of questions for Misha to be asked later on in this hour. I'm going to move on now to Dr. Stinger, Mike Stinger, who's, like I say, the principal investigator for the fluid shifts investigation, which I am calling the most complex biomedical investigation, possibly the most complex investigation of any kind that's been on the International Space Station. Perhaps the folks from the alpha magnetic spectrometer might disagree with me, but certainly in the biomedical domain, it involved a degree of complexity, integration, planning, execution that we rarely see in the biomedical world. So for Dr. Stinger, can you tell us a little bit about the relevance of the fluid shift study and why it was an important study to do on this mission?
Sure. The fluid shift investigation is a study that's investigating the VIP syndrome. VIP is an acronym. It stands for Visual Impairment and Intracranial Pressure. And so NASA realized many years ago that going into space was causing some changes in astronauts' vision, even during short duration flights. After we started flying ISS-linked missions, the flight docs started realizing that some of these ocular structural changes and some of the functional changes weren't going away after landing, and in fact, some of them are permanent. And so it became a concern that being in space for a longer amount of time may be causing permanent changes to the structure and the function of your eyes. There are many hypotheses for this. One is the headward fluid shift that is experienced in spaceflight when you're in the weightlessness environment. There are other hypotheses such as the amount of resistive exercise the astronauts perform on a daily basis on station, exposure to carbon dioxide, maybe on a daily basis the level of carbon dioxide they breathe is higher than it is here on Earth, and then there are pockets of CO2 that they may be exposed to on station. It could be other things, stress, radiation, high sodium diet leading to a larger fluid volume. So the purpose of this investigation was to try to determine what was causing some of these ocular structural and functional changes. It's such a complex study just for the sheer number of measures that we're performing, and that's because it's really the combination of three different studies. You can see that my name says co-principal investigator. Scott Dochevsky from Henry Ford and Alan Hargens from University of California, San Diego are the other two principal investigators. And we have a team of approximately 25 co-investigators and a support staff of hundreds of people, each with their own specialties. And we're examining everything you could possibly examine to try to measure, quantify, and describe the headward fluid shift experience in spaceflight and the subsequent redistribution of those fluids. So we're looking intra and extracellularly, intra and extravascularly, lower body to upper body. We're using many tools that, Pete, you're probably familiar with, MRI and ultrasound. Pre-flight and post-flight, we use upright MRI, supine MRI, and then we put astronauts head down in the MRI chamber, 15 degrees head down, to cause the headward fluid shift. And we look at changes in the sizes of the ventricles in the brain, CSF production, changes to the eyeball itself, if it's changing shape, or if there's swelling of the optic disc, optic nerve, which feeds the eye. Then we have a lot of other novel technologies that you're probably not familiar with to look at intracranial pressure. One of the, before the one-year mission, we all thought that pressure in the brain must be going up, and at a high level that's causing a change to the back of the eye, which is causing some of the things we're seeing, optic disc edema, choroidal folds, changing shape, the back of the eye, flattening of the eyeball. So we have a couple non-invasive devices to estimate those changes in intracranial pressure, ICP. And we have a device called the OCT, which is a very nice laser technology that takes pictures of the retina and the layers beneath the retina. So we have a very good indication of if there's any swelling and where that swelling is occurring within the layers of the back of the eye. And so there's a ton of measures that we're performing. And we have collaboration across multiple countries. It's 10 subjects in the study. Half of them are Russian, half of them are American. Scott and Misha were the first two. It was important to get them in the study. But at the time, it was only a one-year mission we're aware of, because we're so concerned about the length of duration and spaceflight effect on this VIP syndrome.
And you forgot my favorite intervention of all, the lower body negative pressure. If you're interested in fluid shifting, it might be interesting to reshift the fluid. You want to talk about that for a second?
Yeah, sorry about that, John. So there is a device that the Russians have on station. They call it the Chibis. It's a lower body negative pressure device. It's a vacuum suit. So in space, if you wanted to reduce some of the headward fluid shift, you could use the Chibis and sort of suck the fluid back down to your lower body and cause a shift to the lower body. And then you can look at what the effect of that is on using all these technologies I was talking about. Non-invasive ICP, swelling in the eye, blood flow in the head. We used ultrasound to track all the volume of flow, multiple conduits going into the brain and then draining back out of the various venous pathways. And so it was sort of a countermeasure study, even though it was an investigative study to determine what the mechanisms were. We all kind of assumed it was related to this fluid shift, so we tested out this countermeasure to reverse the fluid shift, which was quite a challenge. Most of the measures that we do, all the hardware is located in the United States, so the USOS side of the space station, and various nodes. And so we would have to take our US lab and take it into the Russian segment, into the Zvezda module, and use 3 crew members, and we would do 1 hour of LBMP over the course of 2 days to try to get all these measures in place. And it's quite a cramped module. When we first started the study, Steve Swanson and Max Surov were on station and took a video for us about where we were going to do this experiment. And it didn't look too good at first because they said, well, we eat here, we exercise here, we take pictures here, and this is our multi-purpose table here, and here's the Chibis. And they're like, we don't know where you guys are going to do this experiment. But somehow the 2 teams were able to integrate and come up with a plan and put inverters over there and get the power right and transfer all the data via the station loop and get it all down to us in Houston.
So it sounds to me like you essentially created a world-class cardiovascular laboratory inside the Russian habitat module.
A portable one, yes. So.
Portable lab, yes. Mike mentioned the fact that he has 2 other co-principal investigators on the U.S. side, and of course, this being a fully joint investigation, we had Russian investigators, Dr. Valery Bogomolov as the principal investigator of record, and I think Mike's most frequent interaction on the Russian side was with Dr. Irina Alfarova, who is the chief of medical operations inside the Russian control center. So it was a highly integrated investigation requiring, I would say, the best of both countries in making it possible to execute this. Any idea, Mike, when the results are going to be available, and anything you can tell us about today in terms of early results?
Sure. So we're about halfway done. Right now we have subjects 4, 5, and 6 in flight, and we have the next 4 coming up. So we should be done about this time next year. So look for publication about 6 to 8 months after that. Couple low-hanging fruit. One, we're pretty sure now that going into space doesn't cause a significant pathological increase in intracranial pressure. The measurements we've made suggest that ICP is probably similar to you laying down. And we think probably the issue is that in space, you can't stand up like you do on a daily basis to unload that ICP. So you're floating around for 6 months or a year in some cases without the ability to stand up in space. So you're always acting at this very low level of chronic elevation in ICP without making an invasive measurement. Right now, that's just a speculation based on the data we have. And we have 2 very different crew members. I think it's public knowledge at this point that we had 1 VIP crew member and 1 non-VIP crew member, and they have a lot of the data that we see, striking differences between the 2 of them. So in those regards, it's a good thing, so we can try to determine what makes him different from Scott and compared to the other subjects that we have upcoming.
Thank you, Mike. I'm looking forward to hearing more detail about the results, and I hope in a future gathering such as this, we'll be able to give a lot more of the results in a scientific, statistically meaningful format, so you can see for yourself what the results were. Thanks very much, Mike. I'd like to move on now next to Mr. Bill Gerstemeyer, who is, as I say, the Associate Administrator of NASA for Human Exploration and Operations. He oversees all of the human spaceflight activities within NASA, and as I recall, he was the one that thought it was going to be an interesting prospect to do this 1-year mission, and I think we were all able to fall in line behind him and produce some very, very interesting results. Bill, I have a few questions for you about the background of the 1-year mission, and I'm interested in your thoughts on this. First off, how come we ended up doing a 1-year mission? We've been doing 6-month missions fairly comfortably for a decade plus. What about a 1-year mission was attractive to us?
You know, again, I think when we think about going to Mars and the kind of distances we're going to travel, you know, we're going to be in space in a microgravity environment for a year, roughly kind of time frames for the transit in microgravity. So, you know, I think conceptually we just wanted to get some information on how the body would perform in space, especially for this longer period. We had a lot of 180-day increment data, But then, does anything unique happen after that 180 days? Is there something that changes that you don't see? Or are all the trends kind of flattening out? Or they're not getting worse over time? Or is there some still continual increase in changes? You know, the ICP or the intracranial pressure discussion we had, what happens to it at this 180-day increment? Does it continue to go up, or is it a problem? Is it going to be a concern for us? So I think we wanted to see if we could actually pull all this together, and we thought station was a great avenue to go look at this stuff and investigate and see how our protocols work. I think when Mikhail talked about coming home and feeling pretty good when he came home after this expedition, I think that shows us that our basic protocols for bone loss and muscle strength and vestibular and coordination works pretty well. So that was very encouraging to see that data again for a period that stresses the human a little bit more beyond the 180 days. You know, I can tell you there was a lot of resistance in the system to go start this activity. You know, we were very comfortable doing 180-day increments. There wasn't a whole lot of folks that really wanted to go 1 year. So, you know, as a manager or leader or whatever I am, my job is to encourage folks. So we got together kind of at the program level and we said, hey, we really want to go do this. And then we challenged the teams to go pull this plan together, and they did an absolutely tremendous job. The other advantage was, you know, in 180 days, we had a lot of unique protocols that have been established over decades for both the Russian side and for the U.S. side. So they did certain measurements one way. The lower body pressure negative suit was used predominantly on the Russian side. We didn't use it very much on the U.S. side. So what happened when we gave them now the challenge of going to 1 year, it forced the scientific community to think about, well, maybe there's another protocol. Their protocol didn't work for 180 days, so maybe there's now a new way to combine them. So what happened was the Russian and the U.S. specialists got together and they developed essentially a unique set of protocols for the 1 year, and the cooperation and the science coordination was really unprecedented. So, you know, you described how difficult it was to do the lower body pressure investigation on station to move all the equipment to the Russian segment. These teams really, they figured out how to get the maximum advantage out of this increment and to really get really quality results. As you described, we also got the bonus of the twin study. We didn't anticipate getting that initially. We didn't think there'd be a lot of interest in that, but boy, once we let folks know that we had essentially a chance for a genetic researcher to see the human genome change in space compared to an identical twin on the Earth and compare those back and forth, all of a sudden all these researchers that had no interest in space before, they came forward and they proposed proposals to go look at this data and to bring forward things. So again, I think the message here is that sometimes, you know, the big debate was this was only going to be a sample size of 2 crew members. Was that enough? How many more of these do we need to go do? We're thinking about that now. We had a lot of those debates at the beginning, but I think what we learned out of this one exercise is we learned a tremendous amount that will really help us directly for Mars. And then the last thing I would say is we also need to think about the things that we discussed a little bit earlier. You know, it's a little artificial when you're going around the Earth and you can look out the window and you can still see home. You know, there were, as was discussed earlier, there were 9 visiting vehicles during this time frame. A lot of traffic, a lot of still human interaction with other humans. On a Mars mission, that isolation is going to be another dimension. So we'll start thinking about ways that we can maybe interject a piece of that if we do more of these 1-year expeditions in the future.
Okay, that sounds like a challenge to us in the science community to try and figure out a way to do that. Speaking of the science community, let me ask you real fast. I mentioned the fact that I thought it'd be fun to have twice as many investigations on this mission. I've been told by our mission planners, don't ever do that again. But were you surprised by the level of interest and the level of participation that we came up with for this mission, not even counting the twin study, but just the 1-year studies?
Yeah, again, I think the thing that I've learned is that if you challenge a community with something new and there's now a unique chance to get data or a unique way to participate in something that hasn't been done before, and it's, you know, we've flown 1 year before. The Russians have flown many expeditions at 1-year duration, but this is the first time we did it with this very rigorous scientific data collection plan in place. And I think once we made that that opportunity available to a broad community, there was just a tremendous amount of interest. So that tells me that sometimes you face a little resistance at the beginning when folks tell you all the reasons why you don't want to go do something. Then once it actually kind of crosses that point, now you're going to go do it. Now all of a sudden, all those naysayers are going like, wow, this is a unique chance to get a unique set of data that I'll never get anywhere else. How can I be part of this activity? So then all those investigations came forward. We made this a priority on Space Station. We lowered our maintenance of hardware on board station so we could accommodate more research, more medical research during this time frame. We instrumented the field studies where when the crews return and they land, they go into a tent and they do simple things like stand up, look at vestibular response, how they balance, muscle strength, et cetera. That's also really critical data for us because if you arrive on Mars, you want to understand how well you can be ready to go start doing activities. So again, I think out of all this, I was probably surprised by the amount of investigations that came forward. I was also surprised about how much enthusiasm came once this became known that it was a real activity. So that tells me I'll challenge the teams with more exciting things that they don't want to go do. And then I'll step back and they'll learn to love them and they'll figure out ways to exceed my expectations on what they are. So stand by for more exciting challenges in the future that nobody wants to do in this audience.
I think he's speaking directly to me and my folks. Thank you very much, everybody, for those thoughts. We've got questions here. I'm going to go through some of these questions and ask the panelists. Before I do that, I'll just remind you, since Bill mentioned the twin study again, we were very lucky to have the twin astronauts involved in this. That didn't have to be that way. There were other astronauts that might have been eligible for this flight. And it's always interesting to read in the press that we did a one-year mission to study the twins, in fact, instead of a one-year mission, which happened accidentally to include twins. But either way, we're very glad for the opportunity. I think we've learned a lot, we will learn a lot, and we'll be glad to tell you about that at upcoming scientific conferences. So I have a handful of questions. I've tried to group them into categories of similarity. Generally speaking, they fall into a few different categories. Most of them, not surprisingly, for Mikhail. These questions are: can you tell us a little bit about your post-flight recovery process? How long did it take you to feel back to normal or like you had recovered, and what was involved in your post-flight rehabilitation process?
So as Misha said, his recovery process was much faster and easier after the long duration mission, perhaps surprisingly. After his first mission, it took him weeks and perhaps months to fully recover. After this latest mission, he swam a kilometer the very next day after he arrived on Earth. And within weeks, he thinks he was practically back to normal.
That's great. Wow.
Второй день я центрифугу сделал 4,5 единицы на 5 баллов. Я приземлился в точку. А еще через день я был в Орландии в Кафанке. Я не хвастаюсь, а это реально говорю, что мы медико-биологические проблемы прошли.
Misha wanted to add that he participated in a series of experiments, biomedical experiments, within days after landing. So the very next day, he was in a centrifuge where a simulated manually controlled capsule descent was simulated. And he passed that test with flying colors. A few days later, he was back in his pressure suit on Earth now, participating in another experiment where a partial unloading was used to simulate Martian gravity, which is roughly 1/3 of the Earth gravity. And he performed a series of simulated Martian tasks and EVAs, extravehicular activities, using a variety of hand tools, climbing, ascending, descending ladders. And he also passed that test with very good scores. So he wanted to add that he is not saying this to brag, but just to demonstrate that humans are capable of performing these types of things and these tasks even after a very long duration mission.
In fact, I think you told us the other day that your landing in the centrifuge was even better than it was pre-flight, so you got better scores afterwards than before the flight.
That is correct.
Thank you. One for Mike Stinger. We actually got a second package of questions, and they're not all for Misha anymore. One for Mike Stinger, which I think is very interesting, and I couldn't answer this one, so I'm glad they asked you. Are there any benefits to the human body from prolonged exposure to weightlessness? The questioner says, we know the risks already. Don't talk about that. Talk about the benefits.
That's a good question, actually. Yeah. So in my field of cardiovascular and vision research, I can't really think of any. It's actually bad for the cardiovascular system to be in weightlessness. But being on the space station, as Misha just alluded to, can be quite healthy for you. The amount of exercise they do. A lot of crew members come back in better shape than when they launched because they have 2 hours of time, a little more, a little less, scheduled into their daily routine to do bicycle ergometer, or treadmill, or resistance training on the ARED. So a lot of them do gain heart muscle mass as well as skeletal muscle mass while in flight.
Good, thank you. That's actually a good answer. Thanks very much, Mike. For Bill Gerstemeyer, a couple of related questions. Do you plan to run similar experiments on women? That is, probably see women astronauts on longer missions, like one-year missions? And will NASA do a 2-year or a 500-day mission to simulate a short Mars trip?
Again, I think we'll go look at, we're talking about potentially doing some more one-year missions, and we'll look at a variety of crew members, including women in that activity. So we'll work through that process and see. We don't have any on the books yet, but we're taking a look to see when the planning might be there. The question about even longer duration in a year, I think what we'll do is we'll take a look at the data that comes back from this activity. We'll take the wealth of data we have at 180 days. We'll look at what we got from this 1 or 2 data points at 360, and then see if there's any need to go beyond that with any other durations. I think the other thing that we'll probably try to do is Mike talked a little bit about all the exercise equipment we have on station. It works really, really, really well. We have an advanced resistive exercise device. Essentially does, it's like a weightlifting device that the crews use. They have a treadmill where they can run on, and they have a cycle ergometer. When we look towards Mars missions, at least the initial spacecraft we're going to have are going to be much smaller than the space station. So we can't fit that size of device on those spacecraft. So we're now starting to look at some more compact exercise equipment. There's a flywheel device that can provide some of the bone loading and the muscle activities. I think what we'll do is we'll probably interject some of that new next generation of smaller, more compact exercise equipment into the mix for this next long duration piece. So now we can not only test the ability of the human body, but we can actually test the ability of the human body with the exercise equipment that they would actually use in a smaller habitation module going to Mars, and see if we get the right effect of the protection of bone loss and vestibular and muscle wasting we can keep all that in check. So I think we'll use this next expedition, if we do another 1 year, to maybe test also another generation of exercise equipment. And I'm sure we'll have a discussion because they would like to use the same exercise equipment so they get a nice baseline, and now me injecting a new piece of equipment in will give another variation. I'm interested more in the practicality of how you do the engineering problem. How do you really get crews there? I can't fit this kind of equipment, so I would like to see that equipment, but it'll be different. So we'll have those discussions, but those are things that we're starting to think about as we think about the next 1 year expeditions or future activities.
And that's probably one of those challenges that you warned us about a few minutes ago, isn't it? For Misha, let's talk about psychological aspects of long-duration spaceflight. Were there any changes in your psyche and your perception and your cognition during this long-duration spaceflight that you're familiar with or aware of and can talk about?
да, что это очень важно. Насколько у тебя дружные отношения, это важно. Ощущал. Падал, что падал. Ты скажи, вот,
So, John, of course, a long, a mission this long takes its toll. It is a difficult environment, different setting to be psychologically, and this is where it's very important to have a good crew composition. And going back to friendship, that was very important. That helped Misha get through rough times. He wanted to emphasize the importance of the crew composition. Flying with the right people makes all the difference.
But in terms of perceptions of your ability to do fine tasks, or your ability to read a checklist and understand it right away, or just your sense of your place in the vehicle, or your sense of place in the universe, did any of that seem to change for you?
Вот мы сразу как увиделись, Союз нас выкинул на орбиту, а у меня никогда с вестибулярной проблемой не было.
So Misha hadn't noticed any of those types of changes. Perhaps it is due to the fact that this is his second mission. He has had some previous experience, but he has not noticed any cognitive changes or any problems with orientation or interpreting things.
Good. All right. Thank you. The next question is for the two Michaels, Mike and Misha, and it concerns the fact that we discuss weightlessness, microgravity a lot, and there are those that say, why don't you guys at NASA and Roscosmos just do what every science fiction movie has ever done and rotate your spacecraft to make artificial gravity, and that way your weightlessness problems go away. Have you thought about that? Have you thought about the benefits of artificial gravity on a spacecraft? And maybe we'll start with Mike and tell us a little bit from the scientific perspective, and we can come back to Misha and ask about the operational and the personal perspective of artificial gravity. Would it be a good idea? And if so, do you have any idea about how much gravity is a good amount of gravity to generate?
I think that's a good question for Bill, probably. But regarding artificial gravity, we're very interested in it. Been involved in many multi-system artificial gravity projects, short and long radius centrifuges, as a countermeasure to musculoskeletal deconditioning, bone, cardiovascular deconditioning, and in both ambulatory subjects and bed rest subjects. We think it can be a good countermeasure, as all the movies allude to. And especially for the eye issue we have, we think that's another way, AG is another way of helping to relieve some of the pressure and volume shift in the head. The problem is, the last part of your question was, what is the right level to use? And the radius of the centrifuge and the onset rate and the duration of the spin, the magnitude of the spin, the G gradient across your body, all these are questions that just takes time to answer these questions. And NASA Johnson Space Center is starting up another artificial gravity project to try to get at some of these answers. And so I think if you were to want to spin the vehicle, I think that's a technical engineering challenge that's way beyond anything I can talk about. But I think it'd be a great idea. I think it's probably, if I had pie in the sky here, I think it's probably a better idea than putting an onboard centrifuge on a vehicle that doesn't spin.
Bill, do you want to take a shot at that one too?
Yeah, we've looked a lot at vehicle design to provide artificial gravity, the way it's done in the movies, and that really just doesn't work with our spacecraft design. It's a major redesign of the spacecraft. It's a lot of work, and the challenge of getting to Mars is just tough enough as it is. You're really going to want to, weight is a real premium in your spacecraft, and then to have any kind of artificial gravity is going to be just really, really difficult. We've talked about some short-arm centrifuges, some other things that we might do in some modules. we'll go look at some of that stuff to see if it makes sense, but then there's also, the Coriolis effect associated with that. There's also the adaptation and readaptation problems with the crew members, right? When they come back, when you go into space, right, the space adaptation syndrome, right, where some crew members get nauseous. We typically don't do spacewalks right away when crews go to orbit because we want a chance for them to adapt to the microgravity environment. Then when they come back, even the field tests show that there's a little bit of time readapting back into the one gravity environment. So now if you had a situation where there's a partial gravity section of the spacecraft and another one that's not, you're going to be going through this transition between 0G and 1G back and forth. That may be as problematic as it is just staying at the 0G. So I think what's encouraging with our 0G work today is I think Mike Barrett and I were in a discussion several days ago, last week I guess, and we talked a little bit about the bone loss, the vestibular, the muscle wasting, those kind of things we can control with the exercise protocols we've got. The vestibular intracranial pressure problem, we've got to go think about that and look at that. As Mike talked, there's lots of ideas about why that's occurring. One is elevated carbon dioxide. So we're looking at now trying to design our spacecraft with lower carbon dioxide levels. The carbon dioxide values in our space station is roughly 10 times what it is here in this room. And so we want to look at ways of dropping that. We think that may contribute to this intracranial pressure problem. So I think the long answer is the engineering challenges are so huge. I don't really think that it's very practical to go look at this and move forward. I don't see the benefit directly of doing it, so we're going to continue to do the research of staying and essentially being able to adapt for long periods of microgravity. The other piece that's intriguing is there some partial gravity somewhere between 0 and 1 that's good? The Japanese now have a centrifuge for rodents where we'll actually be able to have rodents on board space station at varying gravity levels compared to another series of rodents that'll be at microgravity. So we'll get a chance, at least in the rodent animal model, to take a look and see if there is some magic partial gravity that actually mitigates most of the concerns of the 0 gravity level. So I think we'll get a chance to do that through some animal studies. If that proves promising, then maybe there's a spacecraft engineering design that comes along for partial gravity. But to think of a spacecraft having a full 1G, I just think the engineering challenges don't warrant it because we've been able to essentially control and work around it by the countermeasures that we have in place today.
Thanks very much, Bill. And I'd like to ask Misha, your perception as an astronaut, if somebody offered you artificial gravity in spaceflight, and you've been in space for a year and a half now in weightlessness, what would you say?
So Misha wanted to re-emphasize that the idea would probably, he thinks it would be cost prohibitive. It would increase the cost of any mission many, many times. And he thinks the existing countermeasure options, the treadmill, the cycle, ergometer, the IRED, of course, resistive exercise devices, are efficient. They're doing their job. They work, and they're sufficient for allowing to allow the crew maintain their shape.
Good. All right. Thanks very much. I have another question now for Misha concerning the future of space stations, plural. The International Space Station has a finite lifetime, whatever it is, 2024, perhaps even 2028. There's discussion of other space stations. Robert Bigelow is proposing a commercial space station. I've seen a concept for a Russian space station in the post-ISS era. And there's also the Chinese space station. I have a question here that says, what do you think about the Chinese space station in the future? Any thoughts about China as a space station proprietor?
Я считаю, что они сейчас находятся в наших 60-х годах пока, когда на Марсе будут яблони цвести. У них эйфория.
So Misha is saying that we should not and cannot stop the progress. We should continue these types of endeavors and other stations. It's probably a good idea. Specifically regarding the Chinese, they may be a long way. He thinks they're still far away from accomplishing their mission. And he'll.
Хорошо развиваются они. И, возможно, они нас обскачут.
They will probably catch up. So they're developing steadily. They will get there, and it's a good thing. And he also wanted to add that India is also in this game as well.
Good. Thanks very much. And I think we have time for one more question here. It's a double question, again for Misha. You're the most popular guy up here, so you get most of the questions. And I can testify to that, too, because over the last couple of days, I've seen Misha pose for many pictures, mostly with young people, future astronauts and cosmonauts, I hope. So these are some questions from people that probably would like to follow in your footsteps, Misha. The questions are, what skills should an astronaut or a cosmonaut have in order to be selected for a space mission, a one-year mission, or any mission? And why did you choose to become a cosmonaut? What did you take from being outside of Earth, and what kind of inspiration, and what was your first impression? So the idea of how should you train yourself to become a cosmonaut, and why did you choose to become a cosmonaut?
Я от момента записания служения в отряд и до полета 25 лет дал. Нет, до первого.
So Mr.'s first comment. So his first comment is he had to wait for a very long time since he applied to be a cosmonaut, and all the way to his first mission, he waited for many years. So patience, and people have to be willing to wait and learn new skills and do whatever it takes. It is the waiting period is long, and it takes a lot.
Я банально. Это здоровье, это нужны образование, которое лучше всего, по моему мнению, это и доктор, и инженер. Вот нужно космонавту давать вот эти два образования.
As far as specific skills or qualifications, health is very important, as well as education. Engineering and medical fields are probably most relevant for spaceflight.
Может было определиться,
And of course, they have to learn, astronauts and cosmonauts have to pick up new skills. They should be able to perform surgeries if they have to on orbit or elsewhere in space.
Well, okay, those are all excellent answers, and I think that gives guidance to people that would like to be astronauts and cosmonauts in the future. We're about out of time. Are there any final thoughts from anybody here that you'd like to share with the audience?
I wanted to thank these guys for the work that they do.
Good, very good. Well, let us call this a conclusion to our plenary. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for being here this morning, and please enjoy the rest of the Congress.